At 11:47 p.m. on January 15th, a convoy of military supply trucks approached the Lithuanian border checkpoint leading into Kaliningrad. The drivers expected routine processing. What they received instead was a permanent rejection notice. Lithuania had just activated Protocol 7, a rarely invoked clause that allows the country to deny transit of specific Russian military-related cargo through its territory indefinitely. The trucks turned around. The supplies never arrived. And for the 430,000 Russian citizens living in Kaliningrad, that moment marked the beginning of a systematic strangulation that Vladimir Putin cannot reverse. This is Michael Grant, and you are watching my channel, Michael Grant. What you are witnessing is not a hypothetical future scenario. This is the documented collapse of Russia's control over its most strategically vulnerable territory. Kaliningrad, the isolated exclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania, is being severed from Moscow not by military invasion, but by procedural suffocation. And the Kremlin has no answer. Before we proceed further into this unfolding crisis, I need you to take action. If you value independent geopolitical analysis that tracks real-time power shifts, subscribe to my channel, Michael Grant, right now. Hit that like button. Leave a comment with your analysis. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand how territorial control erodes in the 21st century. This is not speculation. This is documentation of a process already in motion. Now let us establish what Kaliningrad actually represents in strategic terms. This is not simply a piece of land. This is Russia's only ice-free Baltic port with direct access to the Atlantic. It houses the Baltic Fleet headquarters. It hosts Iskander missile systems capable of striking Berlin in under 6 minutes. For 79 years, Russia has maintained military dominance over this 1,100 square kilometer exclave, specifically because it provides Moscow with a dagger pointed at the heart of NATO's eastern flank. But that dagger is rusting in Putin's hand, because the exclave has one fatal weakness that cannot be corrected: geography. Kaliningrad is separated from mainland Russia by 600 kilometers of hostile territory. Every single supply line, every fuel shipment, every replacement part for military equipment, every soldier rotation must pass through either Lithuania or Poland. Before February 24, 2022, this vulnerability was manageable because both countries, despite being NATO members, maintained functional transit agreements with Russia. Commerce flowed. Civilians crossed borders for work and shopping. The arrangement was stable, if not friendly. Then Putin invaded Ukraine, and the foundation of that stability shattered permanently. On June 17, 2022, Lithuania invoked European Union sanctions and blocked the rail transit of steel, metals, and construction materials into Kaliningrad. Russia immediately threatened retaliation, claiming this was an illegal blockade. Lithuania did not blink. The European Union backed Lithuania's position, and Russia discovered that its threats carried no weight because Moscow could not afford to open a second front against a NATO member while its forces were already bleeding in Ukraine. The precedent was set. Lithuania had demonstrated that Russia's access to Kaliningrad was not a right. It was a privilege that could be revoked. Fast forward to January 2026. The situation has deteriorated beyond anything Moscow anticipated. According to data released by Lithuania's Ministry of Transport on January 9th, rail cargo transiting to Kaliningrad from Russia has dropped by 73% compared to pre-war levels. The Lithuanian railway company LTG Cargo announced on January 14th that it would cease transporting all Russian oil products to Kaliningrad, effective immediately, citing compliance with expanded U.S. sanctions against Lukoil and Gazprom Neft. This single decision removes 345,000 tons of annual oil product supply from the exclave. There is no maritime alternative capable of replacing that volume in the short term. Kaliningrad's refineries are now operating at 40% capacity. Fuel rationing for civilian vehicles has been implemented, and this is only the beginning. Poland, watching Lithuania's success, has begun implementing its own restrictions. On December 30th, 2025, Polish customs authorities introduced what they termed enhanced security screening for all Russian goods transiting through Polish territory to Kaliningrad. The result has been a systematic slowdown. Trucks that once cleared customs in 4 hours now wait for 3 days. Perishable goods spoil at the border. Construction materials sit in warehouses while building projects in Kaliningrad grind to a halt. The Polish government denies that this is a blockade. They simply claim they are enforcing existing security protocols with greater diligence. The effect is identical to a blockade. but the legal cover is airtight. The economic impact on Kaliningrad is not theoretical. On January 12th, Kaliningrad's regional governor Anton Alikhanov appeared on Russian state television and made a statement that revealed the depth of the crisis. He admitted that the exclave's 2026 budget projects a deficit of 12.8 billion rubles, approximately $134 million, despite federal subsidies. He confirmed that imports have collapsed by 68% since 2022. He acknowledged that unemployment has risen to 11.3%, the highest rate in any Russian region. And most tellingly, he requested emergency financial assistance from Moscow to prevent the complete shutdown of municipal heating systems before the end of winter. Moscow's response was telling in its inadequacy. On January 18th, the Kremlin announced a 6.4 billion ruble emergency allocation for Kaliningrad, less than half of what the regional government requested. The message was clear. Kaliningrad is on its own. The federal budget is consumed by war expenditures in Ukraine. There is no reserve capacity to subsidize a territory that cannot generate its own revenue due to sanctions and transit restrictions. The exclave that once served as Russia's westernmost military stronghold is now a financial black hole that Moscow can no longer afford to maintain. But the economic strangulation is only the surface layer of Kaliningrad's collapse. The deeper crisis is demographic and psychological. Between 2022 and 2025, an estimated 87,000 residents have left Kaliningrad, primarily young professionals and families with children. According to leaked data from Russia's Federal Migration Service, published by the independent outlet Meduza on January 3rd, outward migration from Kaliningrad has accelerated by 340% compared to pre-war levels. These are not refugees fleeing bombs. These are educated workers, engineers, doctors, teachers who recognize that Kaliningrad has no economic future as long as Russia remains isolated from Europe. They are voting with their feet, and the exclave is hemorrhaging the human capital necessary to sustain a functioning society. The Russian government has attempted to reverse this exodus through coercion. In November 2025, new regulations were introduced requiring all Kaliningrad residents working in critical infrastructure sectors to obtain special exit permits before traveling abroad. The permits can take up to 6 months to process and are frequently denied without explanation. This is not border security. This is the Soviet-era system of propiska reinvented for the 21st century. The Kremlin is attempting to trap people in Kaliningrad by removing their legal right to leave. The policy is having the opposite effect. According to interviews conducted by the Baltic investigative outlet ReBaltica with recent emigrants, the exit permit system has accelerated the decision to flee. People who were uncertain about leaving are now rushing to escape before the window closes completely. The social fabric inside Kaliningrad is unraveling in ways that Russian state media cannot suppress. On January 7th, protests erupted in the city of Kaliningrad after the municipal government announced electricity rationing due to fuel shortages at the thermal power plant. Approximately 2,000 residents gathered in Victory Square demanding the resignation of Governor Alikhanov and an end to what they described as Moscow's abandonment of the region. Riot police dispersed the crowd using tear gas and detained 34 individuals. Russian state television did not report the incident, but videos circulated on Telegram channels showed protesters chanting slogans that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. Moscow has forgotten us, and we are Europeans, not Russians. The psychological break is accelerating. This is where the situation becomes strategically catastrophic for Vladimir Putin. Kaliningrad is not Crimea. Crimea had a Russian-speaking majority that genuinely supported annexation in 2014. Kaliningrad's population is more complex. According to a survey conducted in December 2023 by the Levada Center, Russia's last semi-independent polling organization before it was forced to cease operations, 41% of Kaliningrad residents identified more closely with European values than with Russian state ideology. Among residents under the age of 35, that figure rose to 58%. These numbers were suppressed by Russian authorities, but they leaked through independent media channels. And they reveal a fundamental truth. Kaliningrad's population was already detaching from Moscow psychologically before the war even began. The sanctions and isolation have simply accelerated a process that was already in motion. Now consider what happens when economic collapse intersects with ideological alienation in a territory that Russia cannot physically defend without starting a war with NATO. you get a collapse scenario. And that collapse is not a future projection. It is happening right now in real time. On January 20th, the Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a statement that received almost no coverage in Western media, but was analyzed intensely by defense strategists across Europe. The statement announced that Lithuania was formally requesting that the European Union establish a monitoring mission to track the humanitarian situation in Kaliningrad. The phrasing was diplomatic, but the implication was unmistakable. Lithuania was laying the groundwork for a humanitarian intervention argument. If conditions in Kaliningrad deteriorate to the point where the population is suffering due to Moscow's inability or unwillingness to provide basic services, the European Union could claim a responsibility to protect Russian citizens from their own government's neglect. This would create legal cover for actions that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Germany has been notably silent on the Kaliningrad question until now, but that silence is ending. On January 16th, members of the German Bundestag from the Free Democratic Party and the Greens introduced a resolution calling for the EU to develop contingency plans for what they termed the potential political transformation of Kaliningrad in the event of Russia's administrative collapse. The resolution did not use the word independence, but it did reference historical precedent. Kaliningrad was Königsberg for 700 years before Soviet occupation in 1945. The German population was expelled. Russian settlers were imported. The entire demographic structure was artificially engineered by Stalin. And the resolution quietly noted that there has never been a referendum in which the people of Kaliningrad freely chose to be part of Russia. This is the language of revisionism. And it is being introduced into mainstream European political discourse at the exact moment when Russia is least capable of responding. Poland is also positioning itself strategically. On December 28, 2025, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk met with Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda in Vilnius. The joint press conference that followed focused primarily on defense cooperation. But buried in the official communiqué was a single line that defense analysts immediately flagged. Both countries agreed to coordinate policies regarding the security and stability of the Baltic region, with particular attention to territories that may become destabilized due to external factors. Territories, plural, external factors. The phrasing was deliberately vague, but the target was obvious. Poland and Lithuania are coordinating a joint policy framework for Kaliningrad's future, and that framework does not assume continued Russian control. The military dimension of this collapse is equally terminal for Moscow. Kaliningrad currently hosts approximately 25,000 Russian military personnel, including naval infantry, air defense units, and the headquarters of the Baltic Fleet. The exclave is defended by S-400 air defense systems, Iskander ballistic missiles, and a heavily fortified coastline. On paper, this represents a formidable defensive capability. In practice, that capability has been systematically hollowed out by the war in Ukraine. According to satellite imagery analysis published by the Royal United Services Institute on January 11th, Russia has withdrawn at least 40% of its artillery systems from Kaliningrad and redeployed them to the Donbass front. The same analysis identified that several S-400 batteries previously stationed near Kaliningrad have been relocated to protect Moscow and St. Petersburg from Ukrainian drone strikes. What remains in Kaliningrad is a skeleton force, adequate for maintaining internal order but incapable of resisting a coordinated military operation. And Russia cannot reinforce Kaliningrad without moving troops and equipment through hostile NATO territory. The logistical impossibility is absolute. This creates a window of vulnerability that NATO is quietly exploiting. Since November 2025, Polish and Lithuanian forces have conducted an unprecedented series of joint military exercises directly on Kaliningrad's borders. Exercise names like Baltic Guardian and Iron Shield have become monthly occurrences. The official justification is routine defensive preparation. The operational effect is psychological pressure. Russian forces in Kaliningrad are watching NATO troops rehearse offensive scenarios less than 20 kilometers from their positions, and there is nothing Moscow can do to stop it without triggering Article 5. The naval dimension is even more dire. The Baltic Fleet, once a symbol of Russian power projection, is now functionally trapped. Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO has transformed the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake. Every Russian warship attempting to exit Kaliningrad must pass through the Danish Straits, which are now monitored by NATO naval assets 24 hours a day. On January 5th, Denmark announced that it would begin requiring advance notification for all Russian military vessels transiting the straits, citing environmental and safety concerns. Russia protested, claiming this violated international maritime law. Denmark proceeded anyway, backed by NATO legal opinions. The result is that Russia's Baltic fleet can no longer operate freely in international waters without NATO permission. The fleet has not been defeated. It has been administratively neutered. Inside Kaliningrad, morale among Russian military personnel is collapsing alongside the civilian economy. According to intercepted communications published by Ukrainian intelligence services on January 14th, Russian soldiers stationed in Kaliningrad are complaining openly about supply shortages, delayed salaries, and the absence of rotation schedules. One intercepted conversation between two officers included the line, "We are not defending Russia. We are babysitting a territory that Moscow has already written off." This is not propaganda. This is the voice of officers who understand they have been abandoned in an indefensible position. The Kremlin's response to this multidimensional collapse has been predictably ineffective. On January 9th, Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova issued a statement warning that any attempt to interfere with Russia's territorial integrity would be met with the strongest possible response. The statement was ignored. On January 12th, state television broadcast a documentary titled Kaliningrad, Russia's Invincible Fortress, featuring dramatized reenactments of historical battles and interviews with veterans praising the region's strategic importance. The documentary was watched by approximately 1.2 million viewers, according to Nielsen ratings, one of the lowest viewership figures for a primetime state propaganda broadcast in 5 years. The Russian population is not buying the narrative. Even inside Russia, people understand that Kaliningrad is dying. What happens next is not a matter of speculation. It is a matter of process. The economic strangulation will continue because Poland and Lithuania have no incentive to ease restrictions as long as Russia occupies Ukraine. The demographic exodus will accelerate because young people see no future in a territory cut off from European opportunity. The military garrison will continue to weaken because Moscow cannot spare resources for a territory that provides no strategic value in the current war. And at some point, possibly within the next 18 to 24 months, the Russian government will face a forced choice: commit massive resources to sustaining Kaliningrad's viability or quietly allow the exclave to detach. Moscow will choose detachment, not because Putin wants to, but because he will have no alternative. The war in Ukraine is consuming resources at a rate that cannot be sustained indefinitely. The federal budget deficit is projected to exceed $110 billion in 2026. Domestic infrastructure is crumbling. Regions inside Russia proper are experiencing fuel shortages and power outages. Under these conditions, the political calculus becomes brutal. Every ruble spent propping up Kaliningrad is a ruble not spent maintaining control over core Russian territory. And when authoritarian regimes face resource constraints, they always prioritize the center over the periphery. The European Union is already preparing for this outcome. Leaked documents obtained by Politico Europe on January 17th revealed that the European Commission has established a working group titled Post-Conflict Territorial Stabilization Scenarios for the Baltic Region. The group's mandate includes developing governance frameworks for territories that may require international administration in the event of state failure or abandonment by current governing authorities. Kaliningrad is not explicitly named in the documents, but the geographic scope makes the target obvious. The EU is preparing to govern Kaliningrad in the event that Russia can no longer or will no longer do so. Germany's position is particularly revealing. For decades, German politicians avoided any discussion of Königsberg's historical status out of fear of provoking Russia and reopening World War II territorial wounds. That restraint is evaporating. On January 10th, former German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer published an op-ed in Der Spiegel titled "The Kaliningrad Question Can No Longer Be Ignored." Fischer argued that the exclave's isolation creates a humanitarian crisis that Europe has a moral obligation to address, and that historical grievances should not prevent pragmatic solutions to contemporary problems. This is the kind of language that signals a policy shift at the elite level. Germany is preparing public opinion for a scenario in which Kaliningrad ceases to be Russian territory. The final collapse trigger will likely be internal, not external. At some point, possibly as early as this spring, the combination of economic deprivation, social unrest, and military demoralization will create a critical mass of instability that Russian federal authorities can no longer manage remotely. Local officials in Kaliningrad will face a choice: continue implementing Moscow's orders and watch the exclave descend into chaos, or negotiate directly with European authorities to secure humanitarian assistance and economic relief in exchange for political concessions. The moment that negotiation begins, Russia's control ends, not through military conquest, but through administrative obsolescence. What you are witnessing is not a future war. What you are witnessing is the documented process by which a nuclear power loses territory without firing a shot. Kaliningrad is being severed from Russia through the systematic application of economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and strategic patience. Putin cannot reverse this process because the war in Ukraine has removed his ability to project power beyond Russia's core territory. The exclave that was supposed to be Russia's dagger aimed at Europe's heart has become a gangrenous limb that Moscow can no longer afford to keep attached. The question now is not whether Russia will lose Kaliningrad. The question is, what happens to the 430,000 people living there when Moscow's control finally collapses completely, and whether Europe has the political will to manage the transition without triggering a wider conflict. Because make no mistake, Vladimir Putin will not voluntarily surrender Russian territory, but he may have no choice except to watch it slip away while his forces are trapped in Ukraine, unable to defend an exclave that geography has already condemned. This is the unfolding reality. Kaliningrad is dying. Moscow knows it. Europe is preparing for it. And the only question remaining is how long the fiction of Russian control can be maintained before the weight of economic collapse and demographic exodus makes that fiction impossible to sustain. Subscribe to my channel, Michael Grant, because this process is accelerating, and the next phase will determine whether the transition happens peacefully or catastrophically. Share this video. Leave your analysis in the comments. And pay attention, because what happens in Kaliningrad will set the precedent for how territorial control erodes in the 21st century. The game has already been decided. We are simply watching the final moves play out.